Hello, dear friends. It is now Motzei Shabbat, Shavua Tov, of Parashat Emor. I want to open up by saying that Parashat Emor, I'm going to try to show you, is a continuation of Parashat Kedoshim. Parashat Emor, which is, of course, Vayikra, chapter 23, Leviticus, and it's a continuation of Parashat Kedoshim, and I want to explain what this means. Well, for one thing, when we look, as I said before, there is a klal, a sort of a principle that very often the parshiot, the perikop, the portions of the week, they start and end with similar topics. And then sometimes it's not as obvious and you have to find it out, and sometimes it's very obvious. Now this Parashat Emor seems to also sort of start and end, but then they added something after the end, it looks like. I'll tell you what I mean. The parsha starts off, God saying to Moses, say to the priests, the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, you shall not defile yourself by being in touch with a dead body, even if it's somebody, a burial, etc. All the laws of purity and impurity, and various laws of what they have to do in the temple. And that takes up a significant part of this portion. And then at the end of the parsha, or what should have been the parsha, because if you want to tie everything together, then the most logical end of the parsha would have also had this end in mind. Because if we look exactly what I call should have been the end of the parsha, so it says, when it talks about the showbread on the Sabbath, which is there from one week to another, from one Sabbath to a Sabbath, then after Sabbath is over, the showbread from the showbread table in the temple is given to the priest to be eaten. It says it's given to Aaron and his children to be eaten in a sanctified place, meaning the temple, because it is holy and it is from the place of God's offerings forever. So this should be, you'd think, the end of the parasha, because it's again talking about the law of giving the showbread at the end of the week to the Kohanim to eat. However, it's not the end. There's a few more verses which talk about a very unusual story of a young boy whose mother was an Israelite woman, and his father was Egyptian, I guess possibly from the mixed multitude that joined Israel. And he went out and he blasphemed God, he cursed God, which of course is the death penalty. It's also mentioned in the Ten Commandments not to curse God. And people ask what to do, and God tells Moses, yes, he has to be stoned for that, etc. So this seems to be a little bit out of place. Why all of a sudden is this here? So what I want to say is like this. Parashat Emor itself sort of looks like it should have stopped right before this parsha. But this parsha ends off with the term Vayigumur to Avin. They stoned him, which is the exact same way where last week's parsha, Kedoshim, finishes off very strangely. It also has two extra sentences or verses which appear to be slightly out of context, because Kedoshim also, which talked about the individual trying to make themselves sanctified and holy, finishes off, you shall be holy unto me, for I, God, am holy, and I've divided you from the nations, separated you from the nations to be mine. We think that would be the end. But then it says, if a man or a woman becomes a soothsayer or tries to converse with the dead, they shall be stoned. Now, the point is, the two parshiot seem to have the same ending exactly, Kedoshim and Emor. Even though I guess more has to be explained here, why the death penalty for such things. I'm going to skip over that at the moment just to get to the point, which I am trying to get to right now. The point that I'm trying to make is that by seeing these two these three words that are coming back at the end of each parasha demonstrates that Kedoshim and Emor are actually sequential. They go one into another. And they're a continuation one of other. Why are they a continuation? Because Parashat Kedoshim talks about how the individual can become holy. And I mentioned last week that the individual can become holy if they work on it. They will not become holy if they don't work on it. What Rav Kook refers to as Gula B'Bchira. There is chosenness within the fact that the Jewish people are separated from the nations in the sense that God gave us both the responsibility and gave us, I guess, the talent for fulfilling this responsibility. So because of this, the collective of the people of Israel is sanctified. But the individual, to be holy, has to work on it. Once you've worked on it, it'll be embellished by the fact that we're also connected to this collective. But the point is, Kedoshim to you, ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokechem, be holy because I am the Lord your God, am holy. And then the parasha tells us what to do. All different ethical, moral things that have to be done, spiritual things that have to be done in order to live a holy life. As an individual, as a community is also individuals. Whereas Parashat Emor is talking about how about inherent holiness. And Parashat Emor talks about three types of inherent holiness, which goes from man to time to space. Man, it talks about the Kohanim, the priests in the temple. Why is that inherent holiness? Because a priest is born into it. If your father was a Kohen, you become a Kohen, whether you want to or not. And only a Kohen is allowed to do these services in the temple. Nobody else can. A Levi only does the singing. And the rest of the people just come to bring their offering or to pray. But a Kohen is the only one who is sanctioned and can legally work in the temple with the offerings. Everybody else is not allowed. So this is an inherent holiness, and you might say a responsibility that they have too, and only they're allowed to do it. Those are the laws of the Kohanim. Then it moves on to the second type of inherent sanctity, which is the sanctity of time. And in Judaism, there's two sanctity of times. There's every week the Sabbath day. As it says in Genesis at the beginning of chapter 2, it says, "Vayevarach Elohim et Yom HaShvi vaykadesh oto," that God blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy, made it sanctified. And since then, it's been sanctified. Every seventh day continues from time immemorial until today. This is the Sabbath, which is inherently holy, whether I keep it or not. By keeping it, I can embellish myself and bring myself into this holiness and be part of it. If I don't do it, then it's in parallel lines to me in a different dimension. So every week we have this ability to sanctify ourselves and connect to the inherent holiness of the Sabbath. And then you have the festivals, the holidays of the year, which are designated times during the year. And during these times, I have the ability again to sanctify these days and be embellished by these days and reach new heights through these days in the year. There is a slight difference between the Sabbaths and the holidays. Sabbath is called holy. The holidays are called Mikra'e Kodesh, which means those which are called holy. What does it mean they're called holy? Because they're inherent holidays, the biblical ones, from the Torah, but without going into too much detail, our months, our lunar calendar months, in biblical times were designated by testimony, by witnesses, and not by the calendar. During that time, since every actual rotation of the moon around the earth is 29 and a half days, every month could have been either 29 days or 30 days. And therefore, this testimony would be the human input. And that's why it's not only God sanctifying the day, but human beings indirectly too, because of the input of what day the festival will fall out during that month. So it's a sort of, you might say, tango between God and Israel about where the designation of the sanctity will be, but the sanctity is from God. And so through those holidays, you can also, it gives you rocket power to reach new levels of sanctity in your life. And each festival has a slightly different task in that manner. That's why there are three pilgrim holidays in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Each one has a different task in achieving this. And then the third type of sanctity, of course, is the sanctity of the land of Israel. It's a sanctity in space. So it goes from the sanctity of humans, being the Kohanim, the tribe, which is sanctified to work in the temple, to the sanctity of time, which is the Sabbaths and the holidays, to the sanctity of space, which is the land of Israel. And this is also mentioned here in the fourth aliyah of this week's parasha, where it says in 23, verse 10, talk to the children of Israel and tell them, when you come to the land which I have given you, then you have to bring the first Omer, the first barley offering to the Kohen, which is done on the second day of Passover. And then it also talks about the three presents that agriculturally are given to the poor, like a shicham peah. So go again, it's the idea of the sanctity of the land and embellishing this sanctity by your relationship to God and your ethical relationship to human beings. So the point is then that Kedoshim and Emor represents two types of sanctity. Kedoshim, what the individual has to do in order to sanctify themselves, because it does not come automatically. And then the Kohanim, that part of the tribe which is sanctified or designated to work in the temple, and then the sanctity of time and the sanctity of space, and all these things help us to give us the push that we need in order to embellish the sanctity that we brought in our lives at these times and in this space that we try to do and achieve levels of holiness, because that's what we strive for, to be an ethical people and to strive for holiness, which is bringing God into our lives and making it much more meaningful and making the human being in the image of God in which we were created. One last thing I want to mention is that I mentioned that these parshiot in Vayikra, of course, when they bring the Haftorah, which is the part from the prophets, in this particular Pentateuch of Vayikra, Leviticus, sometimes it looks like the Haftorahs of the brought from the prophets, even when they're connected to the Parsha, they look almost like a contradiction. We have another example of this in the Haftorah, which was read today from Ezekiel 44:15, because it talks about the laws of the Kohanim, of the priests, and the laws do mimic what it says in the parasha, and do recall what it says in the parasha, except for one exception. It says there, normally, a priest is not allowed to marry a divorcee, but allowed to marry a widow. The high priest is not allowed to marry a divorcee or a widow. Now, for some reason in Ezekiel, it says that every priest was not allowed to marry a divorcee or a widow unless it was a widow from another priest, which of course it does not say in this week's Parsha. So what I'd like to say about that is, it looks like we have here evidence of what we call a chumrah, which means attempt to be more meticulous about the law, a stringency which was probably performed in the first temple period, where the Kohanim, because they knew that they had power, wanted to limit their own power by making sure they did the right thing. Because let's think for a moment, especially in the second temple period, but even the first temple, there were, as Spinoza mentions in his tractate, theological political tractate, there were three centers of power in biblical Israel, which was the king, which was the high court, and also the high priest. So you had the political power, you had the religious power, and you had the judicial power. Now, so therefore, the high priests and the priests who worked with them had a certain amount of power. That's, of course, the power was slightly abused in the second temple where they took over the government, they took over the political power, and it became a theocracy. Even the Hasmoneans who took over later, they were still a theocracy because they were Kohanim who took over the political power. Um, so what happens is, it seems in the first temple period, the Kohanim were sensitive to this, and they realized sometimes you have to limit certain things. Why? You see, the reason why a high priest or a Kohen is not supposed to marry a widow is because when you have too much power, sometimes, or you have power, the law wants to limit you, which means if you can't marry a widow, sometimes, as you know, in life, certain people with power want a certain woman, so they'll make sure that she's a widow in order to marry her, or make sure that she gets divorced. Well, let's say specifically a widow. Why not a divorcee? Because the Kohanim were supposed to be the mediators. See, the Kohanim were the ones who were taught the law. It also says that in this week's Haftorah. It also says that in the book of Deuteronomy, the tribe of Levi in general. And it says also in the minor prophets that the Kohanim were the ones who were teaching the laws. And just like Aaron, they were mediators between people. So if a man and wife got divorced, in a sense, it's the fault of the Kohanim. So it doesn't make sense that a Kohen should marry a divorcee, because that is an example of his failure, that he wasn't able to keep the couple together. So that's the reason why a Kohen should not marry a divorcee, because it would become self-defeating, because they're the ones who are supposed to be the mediators among the people. Why not a widow? For the high priest, because specifically the high priest has lots of power. And there's always the fear that the wrong guy gets a lot of power, they might create scenarios which they shouldn't be involved in. And like, as I said, so they shouldn't be in a scenario where maybe they would want a certain woman and create a scenario where she becomes a widow. So they're not allowed to have a widow. And I guess in the Second Temple period, maybe they're afraid that Kohanim in general had too much power or could have much power. So they decided that a Kohen can only marry a widow from another Kohen, which is interesting. So basically, it's a stringency on the law, not exactly a contradiction. Just wanted to point this out. This was a very short idea at the end. Wish everybody peace. Shalom. Shalom.